All right, hello everyone. Welcome to week one. All right, so each week you will have a video like this, little short lecture video. Okay, these are only going to be about 20 minutes, so I'm just going to hit the real high points. But please make sure you go back, read the chapters. I also give you a PowerPoint. Use the PowerPoints while you're going through the chapters. Okay. So this first chapter provides really kind of a broad overview of policing. There's a number of topics in here that we'll get into much greater detail later in the semester. So there's a lot of information in this chapter, and there's way too much to include everything in a video. So like I say, read the chapter, use the accompanying PowerPoint presentation that's included in Blackboard, okay, and that will really help kind of focus you on the topics for this chapter. All right, so when we talk about the police really have this real complicated role within our society, in a number of ways. All right, so everybody always thinks law enforcement and crime control, and their job is to protect people, protect their freedoms, freedom of movement, freedom from assault, freedom from, being burglarized, those sorts of things. But at the same time, they also have this power to be able to take away someone's freedom through arrest, detention, things like that. And if you think about policing around the world, you really find that to varying degrees how much power the police have taking away someone's freedom. In some, like totalitarian societies, the police have almost unlimited power to do it. And when that happens, that's known as a police state. Okay, so that's not what the U.S. is. Because the police don't have nearly that much power in the U.S. because we're not a totalitarian society. Okay, the U.S. has a republican form of government that's known as federalism, which is a decentralized form of government that limits the power of the federal government and instills a lot of power then at the state and local level. Okay, so while there are certainly federal police agencies like the FBI, like things like that, the overwhelming majority of the policing in America is done at the state and local level. So at this level of government, the people or citizens are much more closely located to the powers of the government and have a lot more say about how things happen. You always hear at election time, like everybody worries about, who's going to be president, who's going to be the federal government. But if you really want to get involved and really want to make a difference, your local governments are where you can make, vote for decisions that really impact your life kind of in an everyday manner. And that's kind of the same way with policing. So another important part of the U.S. form of government is the separation of powers, or a system of checks and balances. You have the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branches. Well, those all share power, and they all have checks and balances on one another. So, and that's the same thing in policing. Okay, this is important for policing because the police are generally located in the executive branch of government, which would be like the president, the governor, the mayor. Okay, that's the executive branch. But those that make the laws that the police are tasked to enforce are located in the legislative branch. Okay, the police don't make the laws, the legislative branch makes the laws. And then you have the courts, and they're located in the judicial branch. Okay, and they determine obviously whether someone is guilty or not, what their sentence should be. So each of these is a check on each other. Okay, so the judicial and the court checks police power, especially the courts, by ruling on various issues related to policing and establishing what's known as case law. So an example of case law would be Miranda versus Arizona, that said that police must read someone the Miranda warnings before they ask guilt-seeking questions. Okay, the legislative branch also checks police power because they're almost always in charge of appropriating the funding for police agencies. So if they don't like what the police are doing, they can manipulate the amount of funding that they get in order to make changes within policing. All right, so speaking of laws, in the United States, the exercise of any power is based on this concept of rule of law, which means that the exercise of power is based on laws, not on any individual or any organization. So the amount of power that police agencies have is outlined in law, and they must adhere to those laws. Okay, so their jurisdiction, all their arrest powers, all those things are all outlined in a series of laws. Okay, so there's several types of laws. There's civil laws, criminal laws, substantive laws, and procedural laws. Okay, civil laws are those that deal with relationships between people, things like contracts, family matters such as like custody arrangements, those sorts of things. So the police don't normally deal with civil issues, okay? But the police do routinely deal with criminal laws, which is the relationship between individuals and the government. Okay, so then within these criminal laws are what are known as substantive laws. And these identify behaviors that are either required or prohibited. So things that people have to do or things that people cannot do. And then the punishments for failing to observe those laws. Procedural laws are those I was just talking about a minute ago that outline how the police may go about enforcing these substantive laws. Okay, so for example, a procedural law would be laws concerning evidence collection, laws concerning how to establish probable cause and what that is. Okay, and then this is where the case law comes in. Okay, case law informs these procedural laws. Okay, then an important consideration here to remember is police use of discretion, where they do not always fully enforce every law, but they make choices based on the totality of the circumstances that they're dealing with as to what the best course of action is in a particular situation. All right, so policing has been around for a very, very long time, and we'll talk about the history of policing next week. But there was a major event that influenced what the police do and how they operate, and that was 9/11, okay, the attacks on the World Trade Center. Prior to 9/11, there really wasn't much focus at the state and local levels on matters related to homeland security and terrorism. Okay, I remember I went through the police academy in 1999, and we had zero training on anything related to homeland security or anything related to terrorism. Kind of only extremist training we got was about motorcycle gangs like the Hells Angels and things like that. But no discussion at all about other kinds of extremism or terrorism. But after 9/11, police really began to participate in counterterrorism and homeland security measures. Okay, and as I'm sure you guys probably know, some of these measures have really been kind of controversial, like the Patriot Act, because of potential infringements on people's freedoms. So the police have been tasked to enforce these laws that the legislature has put in place. Okay, so you always have to remember that police don't make the laws, but they're called upon to enact and enforce those provisions. All right, so a large part of Unit 1 is how the police are organized in America, and this is really an important thing to know about. So, because we're very, very different than a lot of places. So the book identifies three main types of police in America: citizens, private police, and public police. Okay, I really don't like that they put citizens in here, but we'll talk about it because they do. So citizens do have some powers to effect arrests for felonies that occur in their presence and in some other very limited situations through the use of citizens' arrests. But it's almost always best for citizens not to do this. Okay, it opens them up to all kinds of liability. It opens them up to all kinds of danger that they're not trained to handle. Okay, citizens' arrests are a very, very bad idea. Okay, but the best way for citizens to be involved in policing is through calling the police, reporting crimes, and then being willing to assist with the investigation when needed. So, for like serving as a witness, testifying in court, those sorts of things. Private police, what you're talking about here is private security. So this, my gosh, this could be a whole nother unit because there's so much variation in what this looks like in America. Okay, so on kind of the one end, you have unarmed, really poorly trained security guards. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have these paramilitary forces that are almost always like former special forces soldiers, that are now working in private security. So there's this really huge kind of range of what private policing looks like in America. But for the focus of this class, we're going to talk about the public police. Okay, so that's where the remainder of our discussion is going to focus. So the public police are organized at all the various different levels of government, at local level, county level, state level, and federal level. Okay, and a lot of your local police are headed by police chiefs. So police chiefs are usually hired, and then they report directly to an elected official. Okay, so like a mayor or a city manager. I guess city managers are usually appointed. Okay, but either an elected official like a mayor or like someone who's appointed like a city manager. But sometimes they'll report to a city council or some type of police commission. Okay, sheriffs are at the county level, and they're really interesting because they're elected officials. So they don't really report directly to anyone. But remember our checks and balances. They're often responsible to a county council because the county council controls the funding for the sheriff's office. So if the sheriff's office isn't doing what the county council wants, then they can manipulate their funding. Okay, so even though the sheriff is really independent, they're still responsible to that county council for funding. But regardless of kind of how they're organized, police agencies are part of this larger criminal justice system, along with the courts and correctional agencies. Okay, and the police function as, and this is important, the police function as the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. They decide who enters the system and who doesn't. Okay, they're the ones on the front line that they decide who gets charged with a crime and then enters the system, and who gets a warning and doesn't. Okay, another important aspect of policing in America that really goes hand in hand with how we talked about our government is set up is that it's very, very fragmented, meaning that we don't have centralized policing in America. Okay, there's some countries where all they have is a national police force, and they do all the policing for everybody in that country. Well, that's not how America is set up. Okay, in America, we have policing at all the different levels: federal, state, county, and local. There's approximately 18,000 police agencies in America, and about 90% of them are what are considered local agencies, so county or municipal. So what these agencies do really varies based on their jurisdiction, which is where they're located. So state and federal agencies normally have a much smaller and a much more specific area of responsibility. So think about like the FBI. The FBI only has certain things that they do. The DEA deals with drugs, right? The Missouri State Highway Patrol, right? They're responsible for patrolling the highways. Okay, they don't get into a lot of domestic type of situations or any number of other type of policing calls. But county municipal agencies, your local agencies, are what considered much more general service police agencies. So they handle all manner of police responsibilities, okay, from crime to barking dogs to noise complaints, like all those things. Your county and municipal agencies handle those. So if you're thinking about police agencies in America, about 50% of them have fewer than 10 officers. Okay, so you're talking about very, very small police agencies. So when I was in law enforcement, I was a conservation officer, and I worked in a couple pretty rural counties. And there was a town in one of my counties that had one police officer. And then there was another one that had like 4. Okay, so a lot of policing in America is very, very small. Okay, so 50% have fewer than 10, and 90% of all police agencies have fewer than 100. Okay, so 90% of that 18,000, those agencies have fewer than 100 officers. The most common type is going to be your municipal agency. There's like 12,500 of those. And then county sheriff's offices are second with 3,063. Okay, so even though most of them are small, there's also some that are very, very large. The New York Police Department is the largest. They have about 36,000 police officers. Think about that for a minute. 36,000 police officers. That's an amazing number of police officers. But interestingly, even though most agencies have less than 100 officers, 69% of all police officers work for agencies that have more than 100 officers. So even though most of your agencies are small, most of your police officers in America work for agencies with more than 100 officers. Okay, and then there's a whole bunch of different types of police agencies that are described in the book. I'm not going to get into those here, but be sure you read about them and learn what those are. So, as you've probably come to realize at this point, there's a lot of variation in police agencies. And even if you're just talking about like small municipal agencies, there's lots of differences between there. It really varies on where they're located. Think about if you have a small police agency in the tip of Florida versus a small police agency in Idaho, right? They may both have 10 officers, but think about the difference in the things that they're going to deal with from just being located in Florida versus being located in Idaho, right? So differences in jurisdictions, relationships with citizens are going to vary. The priorities for the agency varies. The types of crimes they deal with vary. Okay, so like a small rural agency is most likely going to deal with much different issues than a small urban municipality, right? And there's a whole section on similarities and differences in the book. Spend some time reading that. But really the most important thing to know is that there really is these huge differences in what some of these agencies do, even though they look similar on paper, like number of officers and those sorts of things. But where they're located, how they interact with citizens, all those things is going to vary based on their jurisdiction. All right, so that's real brief overview about how policing is organized in America. Let's kind of move now and talk about the police role and purpose. So what is it? What is this police? What is the role of police in society? What is their purpose? Well, the answer to that probably depends on who you ask. Okay, everyone has their own view on who the police are, what the police should be doing, and why we have the police. Okay, so the police are really this kind of centerpiece and the major representatives of the legal system when dealing with citizens. And at the core of that role is the ability to use coercive force. And even though they're not necessarily using force all the time, this ability to use it influences all their interactions with citizens, because everyone is aware of that. Like everyone is aware that the police, have this ability to use this force, and it really impacts these relationships. Okay, so the police, everyone thinks of the police as their role as crime control or law enforcement, and that's true. That is things that they do, but they also provide a whole variety of mundane and governmental and social services. Like the police are kind of a catch-all. Okay, they're one of the few people that work 24 hours a day, right? There's always a police officer on. So they get called to handle all kinds of different situations. Some things that they're very trained for, some things that they're not very trained for. But they have this wide variety of things that they do. And because of that, there's sometimes role conflict. conflict. Because expectations for what the police should be doing and how they should be doing it varies among the police officers themselves, the police organization, and the citizens within the community. Okay, so each of those three could have different ideas and different views on what the police are, what they should be doing, what their responsibilities are. So even within each of those groups, there's often differences in expectations with each of the categories. So if you go into a town and you talk to 100 citizens, you may get a whole, who knows how many different views on the police you're going to get, right? Because everyone will view that from their own perspective, right? And that can cause problems sometimes because you have all these varying interpretations and views on what the police should be doing. So there's 4 broad types of expectations that influence the police role: legal, organizational, community, and individual. They're pretty well self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into detail on them here. Make sure you read about them in the chapter. Okay, so another factor that influences police officers' role is their orientation. Okay, so at 2 ends of the spectrum, now we'll talk about the ends again, not the middle, the ends. On one end, you have strictly crime fighter orientation that believe that the police should only engage in law enforcement and crime control. At the other end, you have those that believe the police should engage mostly in like social service kind of work, where they determine why people are committing crimes, engage in trying to address those issues rather than actually enforcing. Okay, so neither of these extremes really exist. Okay, the role is somewhere here in the middle, and it varies depending on where they are, what the community wants, those sorts of things. So, because the police cannot only engage in crime fighting, they cannot only engage in social services, right? They have to be somewhere here in the middle where they do both. So the agency's orientation, the police agency's orientation towards this influences what activities priority is given. So what does the agency think people are doing or should be doing? And what they think about that influences how they select their personnel, what kind of training they put them through. All those decisions then are based on what is the agency's orientation towards what they think their police officers should be doing. So what helps influence that then is community input. Okay, community input also influences to what degree the police have a crime fighter orientation or a social services orientation. If the people in your community want crime fighting, then that's what the agency is going to be more toward. If they want more of a social services, then the agency will probably be a little bit further to that side. Okay, so what do they actually do? Okay, we've talked about how they have to do all these things, but so what do they actually do? So there was a study done of 24 police departments that determined that police officers spend like 29% of their time on crime-related incidents, 24% of the time on traffic, 23% of their time on like nuisances, disputes, those sorts of things, and 24% on providing services and like miscellaneous incidents. So just kind of like the other category, right? Other, 24% on that. So they do spend a little bit of a higher percentage on crime-related incidents, but if you look at that, like their time is pretty well split between the four categories. And that's often surprising to people because a lot of people don't really think about all the various things that police actually do, right? They always think about police as crime fighters, and part of that is because police officers and agencies commonly portray themselves as that, right? Even though they do a lot of other things. If you ever hear a police officer telling stories, they never tell a story about, yeah, I went and dealt with this barking dog the other day, or these two neighbors were having a fight over something. No, it's always some kind of real exciting kind of criminal matter, that they dealt with. And that's how the police and agencies often portray themselves, and that's how a lot of the public views them. But that's not actually what they do mostly on a day-to-day basis. Okay, that study also found that the police rarely arrest anyone and rarely use force. But those are the things you always hear about. Like you're watching the news, you think that these things are constantly happening. But they're not. They're really, really quite infrequent that the police actually use force or actually arrest someone. One of the really interesting findings that came out of this was how much emphasis is on interpersonal communications. Okay, and it obviously makes sense, right? The police have got to be able to communicate with people because that's what they do most of the time, right? So you'll see in the book, they list a whole list of common actions taken by police officers. In 5 of those 6, interpersonal communication was very, very important. And those were almost always entirely talking and listening to people, trying to determine what happened and how it could possibly be resolved. Okay, traffic enforcement is responsible for the most public citizen accounts, or not public, police citizen encounters, and really is one of the most important factors in determining how the police are viewed by the public. Because more people come in contact with the police during traffic enforcement, that has a kind of much larger impact on how people view the police than almost anything else. Because most people do not deal with the police in a lot of these other ways. They just deal with them. They got pulled over for speeding or made an illegal turn or whatever, right? But that is when most people come in contact with the police, and that really informs people's views on the police. All right, I'm going to stop here. I hit on most of the areas in the chapter, but please be sure to read the chapter and review the PowerPoints, especially for the sections I don't discuss here. But please do read all that. Be sure to complete your assignments for this week. And let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you next week.